All right, we're at 12 noon, so we're going to get started. I'd like to welcome everybody to today's BIRCWH webinar entitled Scientific Communication with Dr. Malani. Good afternoon. My name is Rachel Greenup. I'm an Associate Professor of Surgery and Population Health Sciences at Duke and a current BIRCWH Scholar through the Duke University School of Medicine. And most of my research is focused on aligning patient-centered care with value in cancer. Today we have the privilege of this hour with Dr. Preeti Malani to discuss scientific communication. Dr. Malani is a graduate of the University of Michigan. She received her MD from Wayne State. Prior to medical school, she uniquely completed a master's in journalism at Northwestern, making her a real expert on today's content about communication. She completed her internal medicine residency and ID fellowship at the University of Michigan, where she also received a master's degree in clinical research design and statistical analysis. She then went on to complete an additional fellowship year in geriatric medicine at the Oregon Health Science University. And currently she's a professor of medicine in the Division of Infectious Disease at the University of Michigan and also serves as the Chief Health Officer. In these roles, she really leads the university's charge on health and well-being of the entire university community, including disease management, public health preparedness, and promotion of healthy practices and climate across all three campuses. Dr. Malani's clinical and research interests include infection control and prevention and infection in the older adult. She's the director of the National Poll on Healthy Aging, based at the Institute for Health Policy, and an associate editor for JAMA. On a personal note, Dr. Malani and I had the opportunity to talk earlier, and she's truly passionate about mentoring junior faculty in health and wellness while developing their careers. And she's an avid University of Michigan football fan and a sports writer. For the listening BIRCWH scholars, she also is a role model in how to integrate our passions with our profession. So thank you, Dr. Malani, for joining us today. We're going to have a question and answer format, and many of the questions I'll be asking Dr. Malani were pre-submitted by the BIRCWH scholars prior to today's meeting. But if you have additional questions, be sure to write them in the question and answer or chat buttons on your screen, and I'll try and address them if time allows. So we're going to start by reviewing kind of overall communication and science. And if you could start, Dr. Malani, by telling us, what are your top 3 tips for successful scientific communication?
Thanks, Rachel, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure, I guess, to join people virtually. So, you know, for scientific communication, so really like we're talking about academic writing, you know, one of my big tips is to practice. It's just like anything else. The more you do it, the easier it gets. Sometimes it can feel overwhelming, and it can also feel like a chore. So I think practicing. The second piece I like to suggest to people is when you are getting ready to present preliminary data or perhaps final data at a scientific meeting and you're getting ready to do a poster or a presentation is to try to write the manuscript alongside. Mm-hmm. I don't think that is done enough. And what happens is people present the poster and then they just like end it. They kind of put it aside. But, you know, strike while the iron is hot. Just keep on going. The other thing is I would suggest is perhaps like for a lot of you, you know, you have an interesting community, you work in groups, is to think about writing groups. You know, having some deadlines, maybe having even people who are doing different work than you, but really taking advantage of sort of collaborative opportunities within your academic space. I would say those are 3 of my top suggestions.
Yeah, those are great. Those are great suggestions to have in mind as we move forward. There were a couple of questions submitted by the BIRCWH scholars about use of social media, either in promoting your body of work or when you publish or disseminate new scientific findings. What are your thoughts around that?
So, I think in the academic sphere, this is mostly Twitter, although some people will use LinkedIn and Facebook and others. But let's say for the sake of a discussion here, we're talking about mostly Twitter. And there's a big academic community on Twitter. And, I have to say I was kind of a late adopter. It took me, I think in 2015, because I was invited to speak about using Twitter, I felt like it was probably time for me to join. I think it's a good opportunity. You have to sort of put some good parameters around it that fit you. It can suck you in and waste time, but it can also increase your productivity, which may sound a little counterintuitive. From an academic standpoint, it's a great way to get your work out. It's a great way, and particularly when you're part of a community that's national, like all of you are, or whether it's women's health or it's health services research or translational research. I think it's a good way to get your work out at meetings. It is also a good way to recruit patients, surprisingly, and maybe even recruit colleagues looking for things. I will say that from my standpoint, I tweet about infectious disease, about geriatrics, about health and well-being, about cooking, about football. I stay out of anything controversial. I try to keep my Twitter feed upbeat and positive. I really don't engage with anyone who is not like that. But I think it's just some things work for some people. Some people are a little political. Some people are a little bit sort of angry on Twitter. But what I would say is don't say anything there that you wouldn't say in a crowded elevator.
Okay, that's good advice. And
yeah.
With your journalism background, do you have kind of some framework around the perfect tweet? I mean,
yeah.
write a 12-page manuscript, or you're presenting over 30 minutes at a scientific conference. How do you get the message across to both academic researchers, but also people in the lay community that might want to truly understand your findings?
Yeah, and I think sometimes you can't, depending on what your findings are. One thing that I like to do, I do actually put a lot of time into sort of writing that perfect tweet. And some of you who are on Twitter know that they actually expanded the character limit some time ago. So it's now like no longer that difficult to get, a couple complete thoughts in it. One is that, you can sort of tweet multiple pieces and just attach them. I do think you want to link to the original work, and hopefully people will look at that. And in terms of engaging with a lay audience, that it is different, and not everything is easy to understand, but I think it's something to work on. And again, when we talk about issues like women's health and cancer and breast cancer in your case, Rachel, these are things that are really, really interesting to people, and the advocacy around that. And there's actually a lot of sort of lay people and also journalists who are very, very expert in this area and follow it closely. So, I think engaging in a thoughtful way, but understanding that there are limitations. Some people will write on their bio that tweets are not medical advice. I mean, I think it's kind of funny that people write that. Of course, they're not medical advice, but I think bringing attention to it, being honest about limitations. But the hope is that you have a discussion. One thing that is done a lot by some groups on Twitter are these journal clubs, Twitter journal clubs, Twitter chats, where there's a certain time, like from 9 to 5 on, or from 9 to 10 on Thursday night, we're going to talk about this particular article. And it's interesting because it generates a lot of eyeballs and perhaps comments that you might not have thought about.
Yeah, those are all great things to think about. I also think it tends to be a unique outlet for introverts to communicate their science, right? Sometimes it's easier than getting up in front of an audience. So building upon your prior mention of journalism, how do you navigate the popular media? What are kind of things to do, things definitely not to do, strategies to make sure that when you're a rookie at interacting with the media, you don't have your word taken inaccurately or incorrectly? Thoughts around that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point. First of all, I think the topics that you and your colleagues work on are of great interest to the lay media. And I will say most journalists really want to get it right. Despite any rhetoric out there that journalists are trying to a gotcha moment and stuff, I don't think that, I haven't seen that to be the case. One thing is make sure you use your local expertise for media relations. Particularly early on, or particularly if you're not sure, have someone help you with press releases potentially, or just even with if you want someone to listen in on an interview, if it's a topic that could potentially be controversial, which some of the work might be. I also have found that a lot of the journalists, they might even say, hey, is it okay if I reach out? And I'm like, absolutely. And in fact, encourage them to do so and say, just reach out if you have any questions, or if you want me to look at the final copy. I mean, that is not an expectation, first of all, that you should set, because people don't have to show you what they've written. But a lot of them, they do want to get it right. And you could certainly offer to look over anything or clarify anything. I think if you feel like maybe something has gone in the wrong direction, it's okay to say, you know what, wait a minute. I just want to make sure we're not, that there's not confusion, because this is an important issue. And particularly as I think about breast cancer or other really big women's health issues, there's so much confusion, right? And so being careful in that regard, but use your local expertise. Expect that most reporters are going to be honest. Make yourself available is what I would say too. One of the big things about getting your work out there, it may be very interesting, but journalism is time sensitive.
Yeah.
And so if people are under deadline, and you respond, they'll reach back out to you.
Yeah. And do most major academic centers and even smaller academic centers have a media office for investigators to work with?
Yes. I think, and again, those of you who, you happen to be attached to a cancer center, usually those places have better resources than, perhaps some groups. But get to know your local folks and let them get to know what you're doing, because it might be attached to your work, but it also might be that they just happen to call Duke University and they're like, can we talk to someone about breast cancer surgery? And for your local media liaisons to say, hey, talk to Dr. Greenup.
Okay. Yeah, that's all great advice. So moving on to writing a manuscript, I think this is where you have just incredible expertise that the Birch scholars can really learn from. What are skills when you're writing a manuscript for journal publication, from the very beginning, staring at a white sheet of paper? How do you start? How do you break it down? What are strategies to move it forward? Give us your thoughts around that.
Yeah, and I will say I have like a whole talk on this, and actually when I follow up, I'm going to share a few articles that sort of do break down what's in an intro, what's in a discussion that I've built on. I will say a few things. One is be a good reader. Don't just read tweets. Read the papers, and particularly those in your field that are in the high impact journals, the ones that you maybe aspire to publish in. One thing I would say is that people make a mistake with the introduction and that they make it way too long. Take a look at JAMA or New England Journal, or any of the top journals that are in your fields. A really good introduction might only be 2 paragraphs or 3 paragraphs. So I think setting the stage, same thing with methodology, just making it clear, making it logical. I would say for results, one of the things that people do wrong is that they start putting opinion in there, and they sort of tuck it in there, but results should be objective. And then the discussion is right, sort of the magic. And I think the discussion is difficult to write, but sort of taking little bits of it, and I can send some articles to share with the group that will help give you a little bit of a paradigm. Other skills besides sort of writing, and I think the first few times you do this, you really do need mentorship, guidance, even looking at other models. You still need help. There's a lot of red ink or track changes that might go back and forth. Sort of put your ego aside. I also think meeting with your librarians is very important. I think that's something that's underused, but going on Google and doing a lit search is different than having someone who really understands those techniques. A reference manager is something too, and probably for most of you on this call, that's just second nature. But I'm kind of that edge, that generation where we did a lot of this by hand. One of the things I suggest is sort of learning to use EndNote or RefWorks, and then actually maintaining libraries, because if that's something that is just horrible to try to have to do by hand. Yeah. And then of course the research skills, navigating the IRB, registering your trials, all those pieces. So having that expertise, and it may be that there's certain members of your research team that are better at certain parts, and I think using them efficiently.
Okay, and what is your thought or opinion about what takes a study from lower impact journal or mid-level journal to something like JAMA? What is JAMA? What are the JAMAs looking for? Kind of what science, what style manuscript, what makes a really impactful paper?
So very simply put, it's practice changing clinical trials. I mean, that's what is at the top of the pyramid. And that's not where my work is, and it may not be where your work is, but the really, truly most impactful research we have from a medical scientific standpoint is going to be randomized trial, usually multi-center, usually novel, not always positive. Negative trials are also really important, but I think people tend to like positive trials, and trials that change practice. And those are uncommon. And a journal like JAMA, there may be only 180 or 200 research articles published a year. Obviously, there's a lot of really good science that doesn't end up there, but I think I would say the same thing. The next year, it might be more of a single center trial. It may be a trial that has some imperfections to it. Large cohort studies are really important, the things that health services researchers do. The translational piece, I think it just depends. If things are really like early and not quite ready for prime time, they tend to be in a different kind of journal than the top tier clinical journals. Other things that we talk about is that if it's a common disease or common condition, small effect size might be important. If it's a very rare condition, we generally want to see a really big effect. Okay. And I will say too, qualitative papers, they tend to not make it there. They still have a role, they're very important, but they tend to not be in those top tier journals. And quality type reports, retrospective things, they tend to not be there. The other issue that comes up is age of data. And this gets back to the first question, right? Like being really aware of your data and like moving it ahead. We have a pretty hard rule about data that are 5 years old that they're not really considered, because if you think about 5 years, the world can change a lot. Now, there are some data sets, including some Medicare sets that are just, they're not going to be contemporary. So there's some exceptions, but 5 years is kind of that rule.
Okay. Yeah, that's really helpful. Those are great tips, because there's nothing more frustrating than submitting an article and having it get rejected and then resubmitting rejection. So can you speak a little bit to how to target a manuscript or an article for an appropriate journal?
Yes, and I think this is a really important skill, and sometimes it is worth aiming high, but it's not worth aiming high inappropriately, because it just makes you feel bad. You go through a lot of trouble formatting something, you submit it, and the editors don't like to reject something either. So what I would say is that appropriateness of the journal is really important. And the way you figure that out is think about the things you read. Take a look at the journal, read the journal, look at the table of contents. And this is easy to do because everything's electronic. And in my day, you had to actually walk to the library and find the journal. But making sure you know the scope of that journal, like is it a basic science paper in a journal that's all clinical? Like that's not. Is it an animal study in a journal about humans? So making sure it's a good match. The other suggestion I have, there's something called Jane, Journal Author Name Estimator. And if you type that in all caps in Google, you'll find it. And it's a really neat site to play around with, and you can put in keywords or a title or an abstract, and it'll give you a bunch of journals that have that particular, it'll just do a quick search, and then you can link on those and kind of take a look and see like, oh, I'm not familiar with this journal, but this one came up. Are those papers similar to what I envision? Sometimes you have work that doesn't really fall cleanly into a particular area. And I think, again, asking your collaborators, what they think, and, having a list, like kind of a 1 through 5 list. And I think that the time sensitivity is really important too, because sometimes, you may end up messing around, sending it to journals that, are not going to be interested in the work, right, just because someone, maybe the senior author, really insists on it. And I think that's a whole other issue. What if someone else is working on the same thing and then their paper ends up in like your top clinical journal, for example? So I think the time sensitivity, whether it's because the results are sensitive or because you're going up for promotion or, because you just need to get it done, I think those are important things.
Yeah, those are all good reminders for sure. Do you have tips about improving efficiency with writing manuscripts? Certainly we are all busy, and there were a lot of questions and comments from the BIRCWH scholars about navigating grant writing versus paper writing, how to fit it into a busy schedule, but efficiency in general. How do you make sure you move a paper along?
Yeah, I think it's, those are really important points. And I would say that I think it's important to move both grants and papers. And in fact, you want to cite your papers in the grants if possible, not just I did this poster or this. There are some things to do that there are some things that you can do in 5 minutes or 10 minutes, like tucked in between OR cases or patients, or because you have an hour between meetings. I don't think writing a manuscript is one of them. And unfortunately for some of us, it is like a night and weekend kind of thing. I certainly wrote a lot of manuscripts on vacation with my family, which, may or may not have been the best use in retrospect. I would try to schedule time. And then I think making that time efficient, figuring out what works for you. Some people, they love to work in a coffee shop. Other people, they love working in their office. Some people want no noise or disturbance. Other people, it doesn't bother them. In terms of just putting a manuscript together, again, like if you're presenting a poster or a paper or a talk, it's the same kind of thing, constructing an outline, dumping a few things in the intro, in the methods, sort of key results, and then sort of adding the verbiage around it. I find that the discussion is always the hardest part to finesse. And, maybe that's the one that you say, I'm going to set aside 2 days. It's not realistic for everyone, but I do think probably need at least a couple hours to work on something. And then I think trying to minimize interruptions during that time to the extent that you're able to do so. Maybe signing your pager out, or maybe like having your phone off, having your social media closed, whatever it is that you get distracted by. We sort of joke about that, right? Like today, you could spend the whole day doing nothing. Right. Which I think is different. The other piece is having deadlines. And that's where that writing group and sort of some accountability, if you will, to your group to say, next week when we meet, I'll have the intro done and I'm going to have the key results in an outline form. So not realistic for everyone, but I think figuring out, and, frankly, for me, a lot of these things happen late night and early morning. Yeah. And, sometimes that's what it takes when we have obligations at home also. Yeah.
And for the mentees who are BIRCWH scholars, how, at what point should we lean on our mentors or circulate a manuscript to get input? We've all had the experience where you've stared at a manuscript and you're not making much progress. And I've had different experiences with different mentors about kind of how polished they wanted the manuscript before they weighed in. Some of my mentors are very comfortable bouncing an incomplete paper back and forth. some want a near finished product, and some of the BIRCWH scholars ask questions about getting feedback on manuscripts, whether that's from your mentoring committee or colleagues. Thoughts around that?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And, it sounds like there are different levels of mentoring, right? And it may be like that the person who, is down the hall from you, you can go and bounce things off of that individual. And I think you should. And, or say, I'm concerned I'm not going in this direction, but some of it isn't because if it's just that you haven't put any thought in it and you hand someone something that's very incomplete, it could potentially hurt you. But if you're truly struggling, I think that's different. At the minimum, if you can do some data tables and put some, key results in there, particularly early on. And I know that the scholars vary in terms of where they are in their careers. Don't be afraid to get feedback is my suggestion. And it might be from your friend, your sort of colleague, if you will, and not necessarily a mentor. And I think figuring that out and sort of navigating that and maybe asking, hey, do you want something that's closer to perfect? Is it okay if we sort of go back and forth? And then for your research teams, those of you who are going to be leading research teams, if you're not already, having like a meeting, there was something like research in progress, which again, it's RIP if you think about that as an acronym, which has good and bad things. But I think having places where you can even present things that are preliminary to get a sense of like where you're going. It's a process.
Yeah, those are all great pieces of advice. Certainly, the breast outcomes group that we run here, we do a lot of kind of working meetings where we're in the weeds with trainees trying to help them move their product along. And I think even faculty find that very helpful.
Yes.
There was a question about what should go in the main manuscript versus the appendix.
Yeah, no, so that's a good point. And I think different journals are going to be stricter about word count. I think the top tier journals are going to be pretty firm about, like if it's a 3,000 word limit and you turn something in at 4,000 words, they're not going to be happy most of the time. Some journals, they don't really care, probably some of the specialty journals. Interestingly, in the infectious disease world, our top clinical journal was very, very firm about the word count. So I think figuring that out, and then obviously the primary and key secondary outcomes, if it's a trial or if it's something that has more of that kind of mechanistic paradigm, those are going to stay in the main manuscript. But some of the key methods, especially like you're talking about things that are a little bit tedious that most people reading the paper aren't going to be interested, put it in the supplement. If you're not sure, ask the editors. They can also tell you the opposite, like please remove this from the supplement and put it in the main, maybe perhaps like how you dealt with missing data, for example. It might be in the supplement, but maybe they want that pulled into the main journal article. I will say you're not going to get that kind of specific editing at most journals other than the top tier journals. And so I think it's a matter of, what the word count is.
Okay. And I think our last question related to the actual writing of a manuscript is how do you juggle time for writing? Do you try and write a manuscript start to finish in 4 to 6 weeks, or do you set aside a few hours every day to write 3 different manuscripts? What are your personal strategies around success?
Those are great points. And I have to tell you, these days I don't do the primary writing on a lot of manuscripts, but I think I deal with the revisions on some big ones, and in some ways it's the same thing. Like I do try to set aside some time where I'm gonna really be able to be focused, because actually doing a revision on a manuscript with an author is almost like writing one in some ways. For those of you who have published in some of the top tier journals, like it's quite a process. Like you feel very attached to the manuscript when it finally moves forward. I think some people can work on multiple things. If there's something that's priority, I would make it priority. mean, to be honest, 4 to 6 weeks seems a little excessive, but probably realistic in some ways, depending on what you're writing. If you're still doing data runs and stuff, obviously there's some things. But I think, having a time frame and a deadline, at least, and if it moves, that's okay. If there's a big meeting coming up, that in your field, the San Antonio meeting, right? Like that's a big one. And you want to make sure that your paper is out ahead of that. Then maybe in the spring, that's going to be your focus to get it out versus something that you're like, yeah, this is a methods paper. It's not going to change anything. Maybe that one's can sit in the back.
Okay.
But I think working on multiple manuscripts is it's a little bit like juggling. Not everyone can do it. But at the same time, the other piece, Rachel, is you have a piece and you send it for feedback.
Right.
And then you're waiting a week or 2 weeks, and you work on a different manuscript.
Right.
So that you are kind of just, it's like badminton, right? Batting things back and forth.
Yeah, it is. It's a constant, I always tell the residents and the fellows, you think it's done and it will be done 3 or 4 more times.
Oh yeah. Yeah. No, and I think the thing is it'll get better during those 3 or 4 times. And that process is something that I think you do get better at it. Like being a surgeon, right? You're a better surgeon now than you were 2 years ago. And it's just, even though you were a very good surgeon 2 years ago, we just continue to get better. And I think having members on your team who do have some experience with the writing who can help with that. What I tend to do with my writing groups and most of my work these days that's academic sort of research publication is with the poll, with National Poll on Healthy Aging. And usually what I say is give me the manuscript last after everyone else gives their feedback, and then I'll look at it. I don't want to look at it first. Yeah. So people know, give it to me last, or even after they've gone through one iteration.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great advice.
Yeah.
And from the mentee standpoint, it might in turn mean that we should reach out to our peers and before we reach out to our senior mentors when we're getting feedback about a paper that they're co-authors on.
I think that could be the case. And again, it depends on who the mentor is and what your relationship is with them.
Okay.
If it's because I think you also don't, if you're really stuck,
yeah,
don't be afraid, especially for folks that are junior, really don't ever feel you shouldn't be able to ask. I mean, if that's the kind of power dynamic, I think you have to question really whether this is a good mentorship pair or not.
All right, so we're going to move from the manuscript writing into kind of etiquette around, because that's another area that I think you have great expertise in, both within your own research program, but certainly on a national level. There was a question from a scholar about citing yourself as first co-author if the original publication is under the other author's name in PubMed. So this is a scenario where you have shared first authorship. It's published in the other first author's name, but when you're presenting your work or on your CV, is it appropriate to cite yourself first?
It's a good question, and I don't have a lot of experience with that, but I do see that being done, and it may be done in certain fields more than others. Both, these two contributed equally, it'll have a little asterisk. And I think in some areas that is very much the truth. My understanding is that you could put yourself first then, on your CV, and then put a little asterisk. Besides first and last authorship, corresponding authorship is also important. And I think, it's really hard because these are team science. And how do you give appropriate credit to people? And these are really tough decisions. And I don't have an easy answer. I certainly, there was, one particular study years ago that I contributed a lot, but, in the end, the senior mentor made a decision that I would be second, the other person would be first, and that in the subsequent paper, I would be first. The subsequent paper never got written for a variety of reasons. But, those are sort of the realities of the world. I do think as mentors, trying to think about who is corresponding author, because that's also a position of importance. And when you present that as like a promotion package, for example, you can say I was corresponding author, which means that I was the one trusted with the data, and I had responsibility for the data. So
when there were several questions about authorship, kind of who determines authorship, when in the process is that determined? Many high impact journals have very well outlined criteria about authorship and authorship location, but what are your thoughts about minimizing conflict around authorship as we grow our own research portfolios?
Yeah, so this is a really important issue, and I think it's one that we have to, this is one where as a research group, I think talking about it, and you're right, Rachel, we pay a lot of close attention. So we follow the ICJME criteria, and there were 3, I think there are now 4 criteria, and you have to meet all of them. Those of you who fill out those authorship forms. What I tell junior people too is just because a senior person like walked through the room when you were doing the study doesn't mean they have to be on the study, because I think that happens too, that there's pressure to sort of honorific authorship. And I don't know how that is and if it's changing. I think traditionally it was more in surgery, frankly, where it was like, we're going to include everybody. It's sort of this their playbook, right? Like everybody's on every paper, even though they didn't really contribute. That said, if you did contribute, you should be an author. Sometimes for formats, like we run into this with research letters at JAMA, there's only 7 authors allowed. And it's a limitation. Sometimes, you end up having to cut somebody, and you could list them in an acknowledgement. But that's not the kind of thing you want to spring on somebody. You want to talk about it. And what I would say is talk about authorship first before circulating a draft. And I think, it may be very obvious who's first and last. It may not be. I had a situation recently from a junior faculty who I mentored, who had put a medical student as first author and himself as last. And, I sort of said to him, I said, you know what? You're the first author. This is your study. You know it from start to finish. You can put the medical student somewhere else, but the medical student's really not the first author. And, and I think he appreciated that I was really honest about it, because he said, no one ever really tells you this stuff.
Right.
And he also had listed a lot of his colleagues, and this is a specialty other than internal medicine. He said, well, some of them gave feedback at our research groups. I said, then you thank them for their feedback. They don't end up being authors just because they gave you feedback. But having those conversations early, sort of honestly, and then I think if everyone participated, then that's great too. And at some point it's like first, second, third, okay, and then in between it's kind of alphabetical. It just sort of becomes that way. And with these really big national studies, sometimes it's listing them at the end, and the bylined authors, the secondary authors, and then the acknowledgments. And we run into this at JAMA where there may be 100 people who are involved in some way, but they're not all authors, and it's quite a process.
And so for the Birch Scholars, kind of what papers should we really prioritize first authorship on, and how do you grow your own research portfolio while mentoring others without giving your work away, like your junior faculty that you just mentioned?
Yeah, I think for the Birch Scholars, and some of you are sort of in that, early, and some are mid-career kind of transition. There is sort of a natural progression. Over time, you want to become the senior author more and more. I think you also want to not have your mentor on every single thing as you sort of move toward independence. If you have a junior person or even a colleague who's going to do the bulk of the work, the heavy lifting, there's nothing wrong with putting that person first, and then maybe either being the corresponding author, the second author, or ideally the senior author. And I think having those conversations, the ones that you should be first on are the ones that you should be first on. I mean, the ones that your primary project, you should be first on that. And anyone who tells you otherwise, I think you have to sort of fight for that. you know, the most impactful work, I think we all know which ones those are. And I think some of the secondary papers that are like not the primary, but you know, the ones that sort of sprout out, the more people you can bring into your circle to grow them, it actually does grow you.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. And I think it, you know, I think it's important, and it shouldn't be like, well, I have to be first and you're going to do all the work. No, I mean, you know, the thing is, these are people that they in turn are going to then bring you into their fold.
Yeah, that's great advice. It's always a challenge between mentoring and being mentored as you
Yes.
progress along your career. There was some questions about reaching out and communicating with potential collaborators, either that are not directly on your mentoring team or at other institutions across the country. Kind of when and how should you do that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it's one that is important. You know, first of all, I think you should be reaching out to people. You know, these days it's very difficult to do your work on your own in your own little part of the world. Like the kind of work that's most impactful is work that's done at multiple centers, multiple sites. Someone may have a great data set that they are willing to share with you, maybe publicly available data that they happen to be the holder of. I think the places to do this is that your professional societies is a good place. And we were talking just before we started about, like, you know, the world of breast cancer surgery, of breast surgery, that it is a small world, and like everyone is at certain meetings. I think getting to those meetings as much as it allows you to, as much as your other obligations, clinical and personal, allow you to be there, figure out where you need to be. If there are mentoring opportunities there, like to be mentored or to mentor, take advantage of them, go to the social events, get on committees if you can. Have people make introductions if that's possible. But the other thing is don't be afraid to reach out to people. If you really are, you know, admirer of someone's work, or you're doing similar work, and, you know, maybe scope out, like, okay, is this a good person or like a person to be avoided? And you know, I think to maybe even say, hey, let's get lunch on one of the days at the meeting. I'd love to talk to you about your work in this area. I think that is Twitter is another way to engage with people. It seems sort of silly, and, you know, to people who aren't in that world, they don't recognize it as that. But I think, you know, the relationship you might even develop over social media can grow into collaborations, and there's lots of examples.
That's all very good advice. I think there were also a couple of questions about outside of scientific communication. How do you put your how do you perceive putting opinions into writing thought pieces? I know you are the editor for Peace of My Mind at JAMA. Yes. Do you recommend junior faculty engage in that? Save it till you're more established?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And, you know, there are lots of venues for this. I think there's nothing wrong with having like viewpoints or opinion pieces, and they may be in a journal like JAMA, or they may be in your more specialized journals, or they may be on like the Kevin MD blog, or on The Conversation, or in Health Affairs, depending on what you're doing. I would do it concurrently because it hits a different audience. Those are not considered peer-reviewed publications. So I will caution that it is important to also move the peer-reviewed publications along. But, you know, frankly, writing an editorial for a prominent study can help launch you in a way that is surprising and effective. And I will say, for those of you who are writing editorials, who are maybe more senior and are invited to do this is a good opportunity to maybe bring in a more junior, a more diverse voice, and sort of elevating all voices. This is something I'm paying more attention to. I used to write a lot of editorials on my own. I never do now. First of all, it's easier for me to have somebody who's great to help me. But I think it brings one more voice in.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm sure the junior faculty are giving those opportunities to really appreciate that. And then there were some questions about your experience as an editor of a major journal and a researcher. I want to be mindful of time. We have about 10 minutes left, but when is it a good time for us to get involved in journal editing? How do you do this? How do you get your foot in the door, seat at the table?
Yeah, I think it's funny. There's not like a clear path. And, you know, for me, I always wanted to be a journal editor, which is kind of a funny thing to want to be. But I was, and I have had a kind of a path with the smaller specialty journals, and then the bigger specialty journal, and then, you know, finally getting my foot in the door at JAMA, and that's like a whole other discussion. But what I would say is, offer to do peer reviews, particularly for your more specialized journals. And, you know, those of you who are Birch scholars, like, you have a lot of expertise and methods. And when you do good reviews, editors pay attention and they ask you multiple times. And, you know, maybe it helps you get on an editorial board. I think some of it is like just raising your hand, maybe even asking the editor, like, hey, I would love to get involved with your, you know, do you have any need for an associate editor, or do you have a need for a blah, 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 you know, or whatever kind of expertise you have. That's kind of how I got started, it was really like raising my hand and basically offering to help. And I think particularly the smaller journals, they don't have a lot of resources. So if you can offer methods review, or, you know, one of the things I did early on was I helped rewrite these poorly written papers so from around the world. And, you know, in retrospect, that wasn't like probably a good use of my time, but it was what got me in the door, because other people can't do that. So I think getting involved with the publications committee for your societies, you know, volunteering, getting to know the editors, saying yes when they ask you to peer review, offering to peer review if you're not being asked. Those are some ways.
Do you have, you know, so personally, I could spend 3 times as many hours reviewing papers as I am writing my own. Do you have kind of a rule of thumb or a way to be mindful about that? And do you recommend that we focus on being really engaged in a single journal versus kind of dabbling in multiple journals?
Yeah, you know, those are good questions. And I think if there's a particular journal that is kind of where you know all the players, and it's like your particular niche of the world's journal, and I had that for mine with infection control. I think it was probably a good use to sort of put a little extra energy. But, you know, it's the same thing. I actually say no to most reviews these days because I'm sort of busy with my own. But I think if it's a good journal in your field and it's important work, it's probably a reasonable thing to. Because the other thing that happens is if you do the review and do it well, and there's an editorial, you might be the person who gets asked to write the editorial. So there is, but I think that is actually a really important point, is you can't spend 10 hours a week doing reviews. Don't be afraid to say no. And don't be afraid to say, you know what, I can't do it this time, but ask me again.
Okay.
But I think there is a little bit of this, you know, ebb and flow, like if you put a lot of time into one journal, maybe, but at the same time, you know, being a little strategic about it, like, okay, who's on this editorial board? Are they all like people like me, or are they not people like me? You know, and I think getting to know the editors a little bit at the meetings. You know, at JAMA, we try to be at the meetings. The specialty journals, same thing. And, you know, reaching out to the editors, I think that was another question that was there. Maybe I can segue into that. You know, I think it depends. Like if it's something that has no business, like going to that journal, it may not be helpful to you. But, you know, if you have a really important clinical trial, I don't think it is a bad thing to reach out. Some people may not agree with this. This is my opinion on it, is I think it's okay for a couple reasons. One is to gauge interest. Secondly, to just find out, like, hey, what else do I need to cross any T's, dot any I's? You know, on the flip side, I actually pay attention to what clinical trials are going on in my world. And I will often reach out to the investigators and say, I saw that you presented this abstract. I would love to see the full manuscript.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But you know, and sometimes the full manuscript isn't it's like not what we think it would be, because there's a lot of issues, there's a lot of threats to validity. but I try to pay attention and reach out. So I think thinking about that, if it's like your specialty journal and like, don't need to make that kind of connection, but if you have something that is truly like an extraordinary piece of work, I think this is where your senior mentors too can be helpful and just say, should we be reaching out? Not because I'm going to look at it ahead of time, but sometimes it's just, we're thinking about this, but this and this. I actually get a lot of emails from my colleagues at Michigan, not because I'm going to handle their paper, but because they're just like, what do you think about this? And most of the time, it's not going to be something that's for us. And so I very gently sort of say, well, half of what we publish is a randomized trial. And if data are more than 5 years old, we don't really even look at it. So this one, probably not.
Yeah.
And they're like, thank you, that's helpful. So
yeah, that's great. And then I think there was a single but very important question about your work in the national poll, and if you could talk about that and kind of what you've learned through that experience and how people progress in leadership on that level.
Yeah, so I'm one of the other hats I have is I'm the director of the National Poll on Healthy Aging, and I am trained in geriatrics as well as infectious disease. And this was interesting. This was an opportunity, and I think again, one of the things I would say is look for opportunities locally. Raise your hand, ask questions, get to know people, sign up to be like parts of different groups. So I'm a member of our Poverty Solutions. I'm a member of our Injury Prevention Center, not because that's the focus of my work, but because those are good opportunities to network. And for me, the Institute for Healthcare Policy and Innovation ended up being one of those places where I thought, because I wasn't primarily a health services researcher, I really didn't belong there. But it was actually the media person who said, no, it's a big tent, you should apply. And it was a very short application, and they don't really say no to too many people. So once I got there, there was talk about launching this poll, like as a signature project at the institute, and it was sort of modeled based on a long existing poll on children's health. And this is a longitudinal household survey, nationally representative data, and we poll on all aspects of health and well-being, but not just medical issues, really things like, are you prepared for a hurricane? Are you, which is what we looked at this month, preparedness, not just hurricane, but other emergencies. Do you talk to your doctors about how much your medicines cost? Do you think they know how much they cost? Pets and health. We looked at our next report is on telehealth, portal use. So things that we think are happening versus what's really happening. And it's been such an interesting journey for me in that this is something where it is so lay focused, it's lay audience focused, and it's also, some of the things have more of a policy bent. And it's been an opportunity to mentor a lot of junior folks because we've been getting them involved based on their expertise. We had one of our junior faculty, she's not really that junior anymore. She's really an expert on health insurance. And so she did a poll with us on how do people who are 50 to 64 pick their health insurance? Right. And that work, actually, our Senator Debbie Stabenow, cited it in her Medicare at 50 bill, which is, sort of pending. I don't think there's any movement on it right now, but I think it's interesting to think of impact in a different way. Mm-hmm. These aren't peer-reviewed publications. They're not grants. We do have a large grant to support this from AARP, but it's still like this idea of taking a little bit different approach when we think about engagement and impact and having a broad view. Now, that doesn't replace the need to have peer-reviewed publications, but it can be something that is synergistic.
Yeah, that's great. And do you think that's something that we should, when we as Birch Scholars have heard many times that this time is to focus on our own work. At what point do you think it's reasonable to open the door to other opportunities such as the national poll?
So it's interesting because one of the polls we did was on women's health. Actually, we did one on urinary incontinence. Actually, of all topics. So I think if there are opportunities to take your work and to sort of showcase it in a little bit different area. Now, if you're like focused on your work, the last thing you want to do is sort of like dabble in like completely unrelated areas. I think that actually is going to be a real threat to success in a traditional sort of tenure seeking instructional track. But if you're not in that bucket and you do some clinical work and you do some research, then I think it's okay to dabble.
All right. Well, we've come to the end of the hour. I really want to thank you for all of your insight and wisdom today. It's great, especially
welcome. Thank you.
for scholars, to hear about all your experience and expertise. For the Birch Scholars, stay tuned for notice of our next webinar, and please complete the survey when it pops up on your screen. And I hope everybody has a great day and successful writing and communication.
Yes. Have a great day, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.